So on February 23rd, 2026, Citrini Research publishes the 2028 Global Intelligence Crisis. Now, for all, this is a macro memo, and it's written in a very pessimistic tonality, talking about the doomsday, keeping 2028 as the vantage point. And this is a situation where AI agents have taken over all the white-collar jobs, and S&P is down, and consumer spending is down, and there's mass unemployment. Is it something serious that people should be going into a spiral for? Or is it a very common doomer fiction that kind of underestimates how slow and messy corporate adoption actually is?
I'm pretty sure I can find you like a similar piece from like 1810 saying how the power loom is going to end all of society. And it's true. Whenever there's change, there's displacement, people need to change. And as they say, human beings find comfort in familiarity. So having to pivot away to something completely new way of making money, new skills can be rough for sometimes. I honestly, like outside of whatever estimate of 2028 and technological feasibility, I think the fundamental question is whether this new technology will cause a deeply negative downturn in society before it causes a positive one, right? Like I think in the end game, the change is always positive. Like the loom, sure, it displaced a lot of people, but ultimately, like without the loom, we'd still have a world where women weren't allowed outside of their houses because they would be expected to knit clothes for their 17 children, nine of whom were going to die before the age of 2. And like that's a horrible world. But I think it does merit some thought as to how to mitigate the step change and sort of soften things to not create a crisis. Traditionally speaking, white collar jobs are not like deeply sensitive to this type of crisis because a lot of the people in the positions are pretty flexible in reapplying their skills. I also think that in terms of the stuff the article referred to, there's going to be a ton of jobs surrounding for expert post-training annotations for LLMs that can reemploy those people. Like whatever work you do now, you could go annotate for the LLMs. And I think we've sort of hit the point where we're going to generate one additional internet's worth of training tokens in terms of like expert, professionally created, paid for content, because there's just so much value, right? OpenAI I think they've materialized $800 billion of fake money out of nowhere, which is a fairly impressive feat for 2 years. And there's now a lot of money to pass around to basically rewrite the whole internet. Our company plays in the robotics space where the game is equally disruptive, right? Like it's not just disrupting white collar jobs, it's disrupting all of labor. But fundamentally, I think it's a good thing that if you go ask people who are doing these repetitive, tiring tasks, doing things like fine assembly or cleaning, whether they actually want these jobs, I think the answer is they would like to make money, but they would like to make money not doing this. Like it's just a necessity. And giving people the tools and the autonomy to open up new earning opportunities, I think is overall like incredibly important, right? You can't build a society where you have this group of people getting underpaid to do all of the dirty work that makes your physical world hold together. That's a kind of shitty thing to do. We don't have a ton of it here in the US, but it's like a big thing in Singapore, right? Where if you visit Singapore, you sort of know the country is held together by the guys who do the dirty work, but you don't really see much of them. And I don't think anyone's like proud of that. I don't think anyone's like, wow, this is amazing that we have people who make 30 times less than the other people, but they like make our physical world stick together. So tools are important. Tools are an equalizer. They help people do more in less time and create more value.
I agree. And the worst part is Citrini nowhere mentioned the physical aspect of AI ever in the report. It's like they were blindsided to that. Anyway, Ben, I think we can go with you next. What are your views on this?
Yeah, I think I strongly agree with Bayley on the point of like if you look at history and the kind of repeating pattern that you see with any new technology, it always goes through this process. And I think it's down to just like what humans do in uncertainty. There's like a fear response to fill that uncertainty with a like worst case scenario, like most negative possible thing, which is probably biological. There's probably been some benefit to us doing that, and that's because it mitigates like downside risk or something, which is fine when maybe you're trying to survive literally, but when you're actually kind of trying to reason about like the progress of humanity from a relatively like safe position, it causes you to like put out things which like have enormous shock across the world, which may not actually like hold up in if you look at like patterns repeating in history. So I always look at that kind of like the pessimistic analysis anybody does on any kind of new technology throughout history, and I put that straightforwardly in this bucket. There's another thing that, like another issue I have with it is the way it almost like sidesteps this kind of nature of like supply demand dynamics of markets, and that like human preferences change based on those things. Like humans assess a lot of they ascribe a lot of value to rarity, right? Like that's kind of something that we typically do. In this world where suddenly there is like massive abundance of machine intelligence, actually will humans continue to just like value that thing in the way they value it now and like not value anything else? Or actually will we end up with some like weird bifurcation creation of value where we start ascribing value back to things that are uniquely human. I pretty strongly believe that we will do that. I think this is played out in the industrialization of manufacturing. Like, I can buy furniture, I can buy, like, I always give the example of a chair. Like, I could buy a chair ridiculously cheaply at this point because it's manufactured by a machine. But there's a lot of people in the world who would pay a very large amount of money for a chair that is handmade. That chair is probably worse than the machine made chair. Like, in terms of like to sit on, in terms of like good for my spine, like all of these things, it's probably a worse chair. But I still want it. And I want to pay more for it than I do for these machine-produced chairs. And that's just because that's kind of like how humans ascribe value. I think the same thing will happen through this process. And so the way kind of Citrini thinks about it, they think about just like a continual, like linear progression of the taking away of like the value work that humans do and a continued valuation of that work in exactly the same way, rather than the fact that human society is dynamic as well. And so you've got this entire piece which is just ignored about what will happen in a social kind of setting for humans as this process happens. To me, that's absolutely fascinating. It's weird that we would ignore it. So I do think in reality, there's a very kind of like weird process that happens as we go through this. And this sort of like Duma response to me is, it's a natural thing of just like worst case scenario reaction to something we don't understand. And at the same time, it ignores general human behavior and what we've seen play out separately anyway. So I struggle with it from that respect. It's too like clean, if that makes sense. It's unrealistic.
Right. I think we're headed more towards a simulacra and then a hyper reality where the sign value of everything will increase. So consumer spending isn't actually going to go anywhere like they're claiming it to be. Now, Travis, we've talked about this a lot, about neutral and optimistic stand on every Dooms piece. So what do you think?
Yeah, so this is one where I'm a little conflicted. So, the start of my feelings of conflictedness comes with my objections to Leopold Aschenbrenner's technological determinism. He basically shows a straight exponential curve that has no variation whatsoever. It's just based on pure technological progress. And he says, this is the way it's going to be. And I think that is just absurd. Like, nothing has ever worked that way in history. Like, what happens is technological progress runs into social forces and then the curve wobbles quite a bit as we figure it out. So that part I agree with. What gives me a little bit of pause in my analysis of the Citrini piece is that while a lot of the details are very silly, so for example, I don't think anyone is going to beat DoorDash this weekend with a vibe-coded app that they came up with. Like, I just don't think that's a thing that's going to happen. Like, network effects are real. I do think that our society has gotten very brittle compared to some of the historical examples that Bayley and Ben refer to. And what I mean by that is, having lived through the 2008 financial crisis, I really am sensitive to the idea that we create points of extreme financial leverage on top of existing assumptions. The assumption in the real estate crash was that housing is always going to go up. There seems to be an implicit assumption, which Citrini is digging at in his piece, that software stocks were maybe already always going to go up. And so people had heavily leveraged their portfolios on that. And so I really do worry that we've got a number of those types of assumptions that are baked into our economy, and we don't even really understand those, because it's really hard to imagine what the emergent effects of releasing abundant intelligence would be and what that does to like a somewhat brittle financial system. I'll throw one more example in here. Recently we saw these bills around stable coins coming into play in the US, and banks are fighting like tooth and nail to not have stablecoin yield because they think that it would essentially drain their reserves. Well, I kind of imagine what would happen if actually all people's reserves are sitting with agents. Like, banks are mostly cut out of the loop and people are just dumping their money in agents. Like, actually that would have the same effect as stablecoin yield value transfer and, could result in like a fair amount of financial chaos. So I would say I just don't know what I don't know. I share the general sense of optimism that we will sort these things out. But I think if we're not careful and somewhat humble about our lack of knowledge in the near term, that there could be some real pitfalls.